This video has been created to allow you to see how VectorCAST can be used with Eclipse to perform unit testing on some of your application files. As a starting point, I set up an Eclipse workspace for one of the VectorCAST tutorial files. And so the file we're going to concentrate on here is manager.c. So the first thing you need to do is to make a modification to the Eclipse build setting. You simply need to go to the properties in the C and C++ tab and add this VC shell application to the start of your build command. And so what this does is it monitors all of the underlying compile commands that are kicked off by each of your builds, and it builds a database of those. And so then later on, VectorCAST can use that database to find out what files exist in your project and what all the build settings are. So once we have that set up, we can just do a clean and then a build. And you'll see over here in the workspace, we now have a VC shell DB file, and that's what VectorCAST is going to use to do its work. And so the next area that we can set up for VectorCAST integration is with the external tools. So if we simply add the path to the VectorCAST executable as an external tool, we call it VectorCAST, then I can run it from here, obviously, but I can now see it from the pull-down menu or use it as the default. So when VectorCAST opens, I simply need to build a VectorCAST project based on the VC shell DB that I just created a minute ago. Oops. And you can see we've already defaulted to that DB file. And so building is as simple as that. All the build settings and the files from your project now get imported into VectorCAST. And so we get the system test node if you want to do black box system testing, and you get this unit test node. So now I can simply create a unit test environment for one of my files, and I'll just call it manager. And I'll choose manager.c as my unit under test. And now I just click the build button. And VectorCAST does all the parsing of the code under test, the code generation for the harness, and it opens up the test environment in a way that allows me to start building test cases. So just a quick test case to give you a sense of that. This place order function simply takes in a table and a seat and an order. And just to make the test more interesting, I'll actually set up the check total as an expected result. The check total gets increased by the value of the entree. And so in addition to hard-coded values, I can also use symbols that come from the code or user-defined symbols. And that makes test case maintenance a lot easier. Because if the price of chicken changes later on, I won't need to change the test case if I update the defined variable in the code, for example. So that's a very simple view of the test case. If I set up statement and MCDC coverage, for example, I can run the test case, and I can see the code coverage that is achieved from that in addition to the truth table for the MCDC coverage, for example. Okay, and so now if I want to actually make a change to the file under test, and I'd prefer to do that in Eclipse most likely, I can simply open the source file from here and we'll open it back in Eclipse. And you control that simply by setting up the external editor that you want VectorCAST to use, as shown here. And so now when I do an open source, I'll be back in Eclipse. And you can see I can do anything I'd like to my file. For example, maybe I decide that the cost of chicken should actually be 20. And so I save that and I rebuild here. And back in VectorCAST, all I need to do is an incremental rebuild to pick up any code changes. and then I can run my test case again against the new version of the code, and I can see now my test fails, right? Because I changed the value of chicken to 20. So I'd have to update my test, or I could actually debug. And you can also configure VectorCAST to use the Eclipse debugger. And the way I configure the Eclipse debugger is simply to go to the tool options in VectorCAST and set up the debug command as being Eclipse. And then I can right-click on my test case and actually run it with debug. And the Eclipse debugger is initializing on my other screen. I'll drag that over when it's complete. There we go. And so I can do all my normal debug stuff here. And so you can see I'm in the VectorCAST. I'm sorry, I'm in Manager here. And so if I just step over this, then I'm stepping through my code. And you can see, oh, okay, so now I see somebody changed the code to have 20 as the check total. So that explains why my test isn't passing anymore, so I know I have to update my test case or find out why the code changed. So if I just let the debugger run to its normal conclusion, we see VCAST is done here in the debugger window. If I cancel out of that, then I'm back to VectorCAST and everything is as it was. I still get a test report even though I ran in the debugger. So that's a real quick overview of VectorCAST with Eclipse. Hopefully this was helpful.